Hi, everybody, and welcome to Robotics 24/7 in today's podcast. I'm Tim Culverhouse, Editorial Director of Robotics 24/7. And for today's program, I'm joined by Kyle Smart, Sales Manager, Emerging Technology at Yale Lift Truck Technologies. Kyle, how you doing today?
Hey Tim, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well as well. Thank you for joining us, and also thank you to Yale Lift Truck for sponsoring today's program. The title of our podcast is Making the Case for Automation. And now, as part of our conversation today, we're going to dive into some various areas where robotics and automation are playing a major role in 2024, and then also taking a little bit of a look into 2025, and then also taking a look at some potential pain points and challenges users and organizations should anticipate when they tackle robotics and automation deployments in those conversations with management and end users in their organization. So, to start off, Kyle, I guess one of the first questions that when I think of automation implementations into organizations, which direction do they want to go? Is it a technology first approach, or is it a process first approach where an organization identifies something that they think a robot or an automation process can handle, and then that's where they decide to make their decision and implement this technology?
Sure, yeah, this is a great question. I think this question for me is kind of like almost also put as, where do I begin? Where do I start? And I think generally speaking, I think it's a process first approach, and that being that it's important to take a step back and look at your overall material flow, and just kind of understand all materials coming in the door, everything leaving the door, in between, and break that down into like individual use cases. That could be, of course, depending on the operation, raw material, the finished goods, the work in process. Maybe it's packed material. Of course, you've got waste, and really try to get granular with your process. And I think it's important to calibrate kind of the team that's responsible for really investigating and deploying automation with their chosen supplier. It's important to calibrate in that way and understand their process first, in that way, because then when approaching the technology side of things and what in the technology chosen to really then apply to that process, that's going to be typically one of the first questions or things that technology teams are gonna want to dive into and understand as well. So having that kind of really well understood and laid out is pretty critical. So that's why I tend to say process first approach, but the two do really go hand in hand because you're then going to need to understand, what are the technology offerings out there in the market that line up with the variables of your operation and that process that you've now broken down. So sometimes I think having that technology understanding can help you to better then maybe break down those individual use cases that I just spoke about. So a bit of a hand in hand. I would still lean more towards process, specific to your question. I think as soon as you've got that process laid out, diving into those kind of offerings, the capabilities of the technology compared to your specific use cases is going to be critical. There's pros and cons really of each supplier and their technology, and I think I would typically categorize, really those, technology offerings. The space is vast. It's growing, as we all know. Here at, Yale Lift Truck Technologies, we kind of see it in, four big categories. And that would be, automation that's provided by lift truck OEMs. Then you've got technology companies that are situated on like a standard chassis, lift truck chassis. You've got, technology that's on more of a purpose-built vehicle, custom purpose-built solutions. And then lastly, you've got the AMR offering autonomous mobile robot. And so each of those categories really have their pros and cons and are situated to address, specific applications and use cases within your process. So again, I think kind of just rounding out my thoughts there, understanding and kind of really getting granular with that first will allow you to then do that investigation, dial into some of those categories that I spoke about within the industry, because it's a major landscape, and then that'll allow you to start really understanding, the elements of each of those technology offerings, cost, their experience, their flexibility, or in some cases rigidity, their capabilities, their service network.
And now, Kyle, kind of a follow-up to that, you touched on these organizational decisions with automation and technology, and it's a big to-do to bring in something with robotics and IT and AI and all of these different elements. Who's involved in those conversations, and how do those conversations kind of go to avoid anything that they maybe don't predict when they get to an integration point and recognize like maybe this was not the actual thing of our warehouse that we decided to automate because it caused more problems at the end.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think your best case scenario, to be successful in the end, in terms of who's involved, in an automation deployment, it can be anywhere from your EH&S teams, your operations leaders, and of course, most of the time, central to the process and the investigation is going to be supply chain engineering and continuous improvement personnel. But it is critical to have engagement and buy-in from the top down as well. So that could be parts of the C-suite, for certain end users. Perhaps it's director levels or VP levels, that have responsibility for again operations as a whole or supply chain, just depending on your organizational structure. And I think the key there is, keeping some of the higher level parts of the organization involved in the approach, is going to allow them to understand what they're investing in early, but keep some of the details and really the understanding of how the solution is truly going to integrate to the process at more of the working level with some of those resources that I mentioned at the beginning. It's really truly a team effort, to make sure that from a lower level operation standpoint, that really the people that are the feet on the street that are going to have to be around the solution or using the solution that's introduced, right, are bought in and understand the technology and how to really just coexist and interface with the solution. But then the also other variables of that solution, like the business case and really kind of the future. What's the long-term plan in terms of automation can be created and presented to some of those higher level individuals in the organization. So I think it's critical to have a multitude of different responsible parties involved when you're automating. For that reason, you'll really then see long-term success and a little more, I think, understanding and flexibility when there are things that you run into that weren't expected, because there is going to be bumps along the road, right? That's a part of automating, and so just having that engagement, I think, will ease you through some of those times of challenge and stress when automating.
We'll get back to the bumps in the road sort of thing a little bit later on, but we've talked about a lot of the automation projects and the very start of these conversations at organizations as they're looking to identify and find the right technology and that proper match. But I'm curious what you see and what Yale sees as some segments in the warehouse under the supply chain, warehousing, logistics sectors that you guys think are ripe for new automation or further amounts of automation for these type of projects.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the good news is there's a variety of industries and their respective, we'll call them typical use cases that are absolutely ripe for automation. I think that again depends on the type of automated solution that you're introducing. Is it a solution that's more horizontally focused? Maybe that's a tow tractor or some form of low level pallet mover. And traditionally, your auto and like transport manufacturing industries, retail and e-com, of course, just general manufacturing. All of those segments are going to have applications that are suitable, generally speaking, for new or continued automation. And I'll kind of tie these things together here in a moment. Specific to I think as you go more vertical in nature when automating, we're talking now maybe food distribution, food processing spaces, also retail and e-com, especially if you're now introducing mobile automation, with forks, for instance. When it comes down to not just specific to like these different segments, in the industry. I think being primed for automation, it really there's another layer of the onion, that you've really got to take a look at, and that's just kind of ties back into our first question, but that the not just the process, but kind of the supporting details of that process. So what's repeatable. What specific use case do you have moving around the facility that is done on multiple shift basis and has multiple operators that are handling that on a repeatable basis? Other parts of that process that present more consistent throughput versus peaks and valleys, which can be really challenging to automate, as you might imagine. And then, of course, getting more into the weeds, but keeping it fairly high level, is what are the characteristics of the loads that the equipment needs to move? What are the environmental factors that allow the solution to navigate and know where it's at in the facility? And so, if you're in one of those segments that I mentioned, and you're looking to to introduce new automation or further automation, whether it's horizontal or vertical, that's a really good starting point. I think you're in a space that's absolutely primed for automation, but just understanding those specific details, tying back to that process, be able to solidify, being ready to introduce automation ultimately. And so that's kind of what comes to mind for me, in terms of the segments, Tim.
Another element that organizations in their planning and research and probably even initial deployment phase that I want to hit on as part of our conversation today, Kyle, are some pain points and some things that can come up along the way that organizations might expect to encounter, might be surprised to encounter when they're really boiling down to the type of automation, technology, robotics that they want to get into their warehouses, into their supply chains, and what are some maybe two or three top pain points that an organization can expect when they're looking for either a new or expanded automation offering in their structures, in their organization, in their warehouse.
Sure. So the first one that comes to mind for me is arguably, the most, it's closest to me, in terms of like my experience, and that is going to be just really the flexibility, the partnership that you create, both as the end user and with the technology supplier that you choose to automate with. Having flexibility is twofold in my response here. So, really, we know that one thing that's constant in a multitude of those industry segments that we just talked about is change to process and to layout. So while you've got a plan and you're introducing automation, is being mindful of the future. And so what is the flexibility of the solution, can present a pain point for organizations, and maybe not being completely cognizant of that going into their selection and introducing that solution. And then likewise is what is the flexibility that you as an organization have when introducing that solution? Because there's a lot of great technology offerings out there in the industry right now, but I'd argue that it's critical to have that mindset, no matter what you're introducing, meaning that, hey, let's think about doing this particular part of the process in a slightly different way. Let's resituate parts of the layout to help better accommodate and make that automation successful. And so being not being completely resistant to change in process and layout on the end user side is just as critical to understanding the flexibility that the solution you're introducing long term can deal with the complexities that we know are that's real world factors that each and every one of our end users has to deal with. And so in terms of being committed to that solution that you've chosen, I think that's key. The second one is cost, of course. I think if you think about those categories we talked about earlier, again, each type of solution, whether it's a custom purpose built, whether it's an AMR, maybe it's something that's situated on an OEM chassis, they all have their different price points. And just being able to, frame up the right project that achieves the right business case, for those, C-suite and executives, those decision makers that we talked about earlier, I think That could be sometimes more challenging, and therefore that why I think of it as a pain point than folks expect. But again, that's why it's critical. I think a lot of this conversation we're having, ties together to find those right areas, with multiple shifts and multiple headcount that can create that business case for you, especially as your project takes on more complexity when you're automating. And then I think the last pain point comes to mind is just general reliability of the solution, the technology that you're choosing. As I've spoken about, there's a lot to choose from, and that's only growing. And so I think seeking to kind of see the forest through the trees, if you will, and determining, hey, what's the proof in the pudding? The actual experience, the number of deployed assets that the different suppliers have, and therefore being able to instill confidence in your selection by being able to experience that technology, whether it be in a demonstration or a pilot or at various experience centers, I think is pretty key. I think that it's tough to I think and therefore painful to kind of determine reliability of the technology without seeing it and know that hey there is like I said proof in the pudding here in terms of like what this technology can do for us.
Now, you mentioned some of those pain points, and if you flip that around, it almost seems like those are KPIs for organizations. And that's kind of what the next question I wanted to ask you in today's program was about, are KPIs really the end all be all of an automation robotics deployment? Is that how, you think an organization should really consider whether their deployment or their implementation integration was a success, or is that just a slice of the pie when identifying if what we intended to do with this project met our goals and was ultimately the right decision as we expand our technological offerings with what we're doing in a day-to-day operations basis?
Sure. I think that the specific answer to your question is I think it's just a piece of the pie. I don't think it's the end all be all. KPIs are certainly important. I think that allows, of course, the end user to continuously evaluate, their investment, to be able to, to prove that business case that we just talked about, to be able to justify future investments, just as important. At the end of the day, we've seen here at Yale Lift Truck Technologies that there's a lot of various factors that customers are looking to ultimately address in automating. It's not consistent. It could be safety. It could be efficiency. It could be an increase in output or throughput, if you will, future proofing even. So I think there's a lot of different metrics that are important to various customers, and that ultimately correlates to what KPIs are important to them. I think there's standards that you want to be mindful of when you're considering an automation project. Your overall equipment efficiency. OEE. I'm sure many people have heard of that. Your perfect missions. Are really that the level of intervention that's required. Manually. When intervening with that technology on a daily basis, your mean time between failures, so on and so forth. So the list can get quite long, but I just, yeah, I think it's just a piece of the pie. What else comes to mind for me, since it's not the end all be all, is going to be, I think, just ownership and embracing the solution that, has been implemented is arguably, the most critical piece, to being successful long term. So really having a little bit like we talked about earlier, the buy-in at the working level within the facility, and having really like a champion or multiple champions, depending on the size of your automation project, that are responsible for that system, and they know it just as well as the supplier, right? Through that partnership and that training, that's gonna be ultimately key for the success of that project beyond just the metrics that you're evaluating on a daily and weekly basis. And for that matter, having that ownership and having those champions that you've dedicated to that system are going to directly, they're going to directly impact those KPIs that you're seeing, and evaluating, no matter where you're at in the organization. And so I think there's a misconception that you can automate a certain process and I think in the end of the day, it comes back to what type of solution you're introducing. But once you've automated, you can just kind of set it and forget it, and that's just simply not true. All the different offerings in the industry are you've got various forms of sensor and technology, but it's some form of equipment too. Mechanical functioning equipment. There has to be folks that are owning that and taking care of that solution in the way that it's intended to be.
One other question that I had for you as part of today's program goes back to ongoing challenges with labor and workforce, and specifically just the availability of a workforce to be handling so many of these processes. And, obviously, we're talking about today a lot the warehouse space and lift trucks, obviously, with what Yale is doing. But, what do you think about workforce shortages and what that correlates to with automation deployments? Do you feel that it has expedited how much automation we're seeing in these warehouses and workspaces? Or do you think it's organizations more playing catch up to, maybe they see that the grass is greener with their competing company because they deployed more robots, or, everybody's still picking up the pieces from the pandemic a couple of years ago. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are in regards to, workforce shortages and labor challenges that organizations are facing and what that has meant for automation and robotics.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the labor challenges, specific to automation, likely, I guess, no secret that we see, a number of end users that, have had to hire, just the labor that is available, whether they're skilled or not, in what they ultimately need them to do, with it throughout that process, operating machinery or lift truck equipment, so on and so forth. And that experience, of course, is leading to a number of challenges for them within their operation. Damage to both equipment and product, of course. In certain cases, looking to solve those gaps in their process from a headcount perspective by introducing, even more fixed automation in certain cases where mobile automation may be the more appropriate solution. And those fixed solutions can present their own challenges as well. So, I think speaking to the second part of your question, I think there's now more than ever, there's absolute interest in finding ways to automate, of course. So I would say that I think it's raised the number of conversations that are being had with automation suppliers. There's a heightened sense of needing to find ways to introduce that. And I think that ties nicely back to like the way that we opened is, well, how do I do that? And so, I don't think it's as much playing catch up, to be honest with you. I think that, there are, of course, across industries, certainly leaders in each industry that have automated parts of their processes that are, extend back several decades. But generally speaking, I think just now in the past, 5 to 10 years, is where organizations are dedicating resources like we talked about earlier that are responsible for understanding their process, then understanding and evaluating technology and setting themselves up for success. And so I think there's a lot of peers within their own industries, that are in similar situations, really looking to educate themselves on that technology, versus their application, and then again choose the right category like I talked about earlier, and understand the pros and cons of each of those categories. Higher price point, more flexibility, really built for certain applications. Service. I haven't spoke a lot about service, but I almost would be remiss if I didn't emphasize that element of really partnering with the right supplier, making sure that there's service and aftermarket support, and how that works. And I mean, that's a key part, right, of success. Once you've got that in there and it's now operating, okay, if something goes wrong, right, how are we taking care of that? How are we keeping that part of your process now moving, since it's automated? Is something that you have been able to, of course, reallocate headcount and put them to more engaging task. So, I think that's really where I would argue, the kind of labor challenge, how it's affected automation. It's definitely I think it's expediting the awareness and therefore driving more and more conversations. So that's something that we're super excited to be a part of here at Yale Lift Truck Technologies.
Well, Kyle, I just want to say, obviously, a thank you for joining me today as part of our podcast with Robotics 24/7, and having a conversation about making the case for automation and hearing what you and Yale Lift Trucks are getting involved with in these features. And again, I appreciate you taking the time, and I think it's a really important conversation for organizations across industries in how they're talking about and thinking about different forms of robotics and technology and automation that can potentially help them in their day-to-day operations. So I do just want to thank you again, Kyle, for your time. It was a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. I appreciate you having me on. I appreciate everyone that's listened in today, and yeah, I look forward to having more conversations in the future.
I want to say thanks again to our guest, Kyle Smart, Sales Manager, Emerging Technology at Yale Lift Truck Technologies, for joining me on our program. And also thanks to Yale for sponsoring today's Robotics 24/7 podcast. And you can stay up to date with everything from Yale Lift Truck Technologies across the company's social media platforms: Facebook, LinkedIn, and also Twitter X. Now, our viewers, you can listen to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, TuneIn, and Amazon. And we hope that you enjoyed today's program and look forward to having more conversations on the Robotics 24/7 podcast soon.